Good evening and welcome to your second session on poetry, where we're going to be focusing on your Unit 3 paper. This is a Cadw and Cymru revision session and it'll focus on English literature, as I said, Unit 3. It'll be presented by myself, Mrs Cathy Davies, and I'm from Ysgol Gyfun Gymraeg Brymyrddin. The session will last around 40 minutes or so, and I intend to go through today looking at kind of making connections, what the second part of the paper, Unit 3 paper, is about, so looking at the unseen. And obviously if you have any questions, if you can please email them over and I will endeavour to answer anything that you're unsure of. All of the resources that are here, the PowerPoint, etc., will be uploaded to the e-sgol website in the Cadw and Cymru area. Okay. So like I said, we're going to be looking at the Unit 3 part of the paper. So we looked last week, the Section B, part of the paper, we looked last week at Unit 3, Section A, and we're looking this week more at the Section B part, so the unseen. So just to kind of familiarise yourself with the course and the paper, so we went over this a little bit last week where we looked at the possible choices here that you could have for your course, okay, so Donne, Rossetti, Blake, Milton and Chaucer, and looking at the split between both papers. So as you can see, Section A, there's no allocation to the comparisons or the comparative analysis for Section A. However, here in Section B, you can see the weighting of the AO4, which is the connections, it's being double weighted, so your 30 marks is there. So, like I said, we're going to be looking more at the unseen today. So just looking over then what the paper is sort of constructed like. So this would be the front of your paper. So it tells you that you need to answer question section A and one question section B. It also informs you in that section highlighted here, information for candidates, that each section carries 60 marks, and the number of marks given in brackets at the end of each question. It advises you in section A to spend 20 minutes on part 1 and 40 minutes on part 2, which will give you then an hour then for your section B. And then if we look at the question selection and wording, so section B, sort of looking at the unseen poetry. So it states here that they will, so GABAC, WJC, will reward well-informed and well-organised responses, which are creatively engaged and which make use of appropriate terminology. So entitled as the AO1 here, okay. Candidates will also need to demonstrate their analytical skills as they explore poets' use of language, imagery and literary devices. So the analytical skills that we were discussing last week obviously come into play here as well. In the rubric for this section, candidates are also informed that they will need to make relevant connections between poems, so making the links between the poems that are given to you. Okay, looking at connections, comparisons, things which are similar, things which are different quite possibly. Okay, and that's your AO4. The following guidelines indicate where and how rewards can be earned. And obviously when we're thinking about the assessment grid and the numerical mark that's allocated, the fact that there's 30 marks being awarded to AO4, it shows the focus. And obviously if you're not comparing, then obviously, or you've got very little in way of comparison, this is going to have quite a detrimental impact then to your final mark, final grade. So the question selection and wording that we've got here, so this is an example from the 2019 paper from WJC. So section B, unseen poetry. So in your response, you're required to analyse how meanings are shaped and explore connections across poems. So if you look at the question, compare the presentation of spring in poem A, The Trees Are Down by Charlotte Mew, and one other poem. Okay, so this is where sometimes candidates go wrong. Okay, you must use and look at poem A. Okay, poem A is like the core text. Okay, so the one that must be used, and then you choose either B, C, or D. Okay, but A is a must. A is not optional for you. It's integral that you use A. So it says either poem B, Injust by E. Cummings, or poem C, Turning by John Ormond, or poem D, Spring by Edna St Vincent Millay. Okay, so they're your options. So you'll have a copy of each of those then in your examination paper. So you've got the poem A, The Trees Are Down, there by Charlotte Mew. So this is the must-do poem, okay? You must use that one. That has to feature in your analysis and in your response to this question, okay? You'll have to, you can then choose then poem B, so In Just by E. Cummings, okay? This also, poem C, Turning by John Ormond, okay, is also an optional poem, okay? And then poem D, Spring by Edna St Vincent Millay. So they're the three options, but like I said, A is the one that must feature. A is the one that you must discuss. So if we quickly, before we look at a couple of the poems in a little bit more depth, if we quickly think about the feedback that's been given by examiners, focusing on those poems that we've just quickly glanced over, obviously those poems will be on the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to print out the PowerPoint slides, you'll be able to make your own analysis looking at your chosen two. It states here in examiner feedback that the most popular combination was poem A, The Trees Are Down by Charlotte Mew, like I said, is the must-have poem, and poem D, Spring by Edna St Vincent Millay. So, and what WJC stated when it comes to this examination is that candidates seem to focus on Millay's cynical, offhand attitude to spring, comparing her abrupt tone and brief statements to Mew's passionate, deeply engaged, and more lyrical defence of the trees of the season. John Ormond's Turning was almost as popular, and In Just Spring was a more of a minority choice. I think with E. Cummings, that poem, maybe the way in which it's structured and way it looks on the page, possibly would have put a few candidates off maybe attempting it, okay? But all poems, when it came to the results, seemed equally accessible. When candidates went wrong, it was when they misjudged the tone of the poem, as in going off on a bit of a tangent or something which was a little bit inaccurate. So looking at the idea of misreadings, okay? But it does say here, and something that I've already touched upon, is that the more obvious struggle and the issue more than anything was the candidates' struggle to address AO4. Okay, AO4 being the connections that are being made between both poems. Okay, and the idea to do it competently. Okay, so either forgetting about it or not maybe giving it as much attention as what maybe it warrants. Okay, some of the points that are being made here is that a surprising number of candidates failed to discuss poem A, the poem the comparison had to be based on. Okay, so like it says here, a surprising number of candidates, as in more than what you would expect. You know, people can be forgiven, however, you've got to be very careful that you read the instructions to candidates on the front of that paper, okay? Obviously, this caused this is really self-penalising and caused a lot of candidates to have grades lower than what maybe they'd anticipated. The majority of candidates were well aware of the importance of AO4 and sensibly began their responses with kind of some sort of an outline of a comparison of their two poems. And obviously this allowed them to keep a focus on connections for the rest of the response. And that's something that I would definitely suggest, is that you open with connections, you open with the links, you open with the comparisons, in order to ensure that that's your sort of mindset, and that's the way that you continue to approach it throughout the course of the examination. Okay. Again, lots of praise being awarded to candidates, lots of wonderful answers, showing great skill. Many candidates, you know, section B, where you can show a little bit of originality, show a little bit of flair, was the most successful part of the paper. Okay, where you're able just to react to what you see in front of you, and you demonstrate your ability to analyse, to respond creatively, imaginatively, innovatively, really, to the poetry put in front of you. Another comment is that it was interesting to see how contemporary concerns affected readings of poem A. Many candidates, they saw it as a poem about deforestation. They looked at the environmental link, how humans were destroying the natural world. And and they linked it to kind of environmental movements of, you know, nowadays and more sort of political approaches. Some argued that Mew's religious beliefs were a major influence of what they saw as more of a polemic than a poem, and just that quite intense reminder from WJC that all candidates must respond to that first poem to poem A. Okay. So what we've got here then are a couple of overviews. So we're looking at the bands, so looking at band 2, band 3, and then we'll have band 4 and 5. So looking at the overview that's provided to kind of focus on both and bring connections in. So you've got your band 2 response, where it says both poems mention death. In Mew's poem, she remembers seeing a dead rat in a spring a long time ago, and says that in spring, even a dead rat should be alive, while Millay thinks spring tries to hide death. So you've got a very sort of vague link, okay, with this idea of death here, okay. Notice how there's no textual support here, okay. Note it's very brief, no textual analysis, no development of that connection, okay. Although they use this quotation, even a dead rat should be alive, there's no actual discussion of the language, okay? So although there's textual support, there's no textual analysis. Band 3 then, what you've got is the response that states, both poems speak of death. Mew thinks it is out of place in spring, and says strongly and angrily at the end of the third verse, even a rat should be alive. After describing her memory in some detail of how it lay in the mud of the drive. The rhyme words bring out the contrast between the dead rat and being alive. Millay, on the other hand, thinks death is actually a part of spring, so it's only apparent that there is no death. The so-called beauty of spring, Millay thinks, is not enough. Okay, so if we think of Mew's poem, okay, here, because where she talks about the even the rat should be alive, she places that in the month of May, so obviously the reference to spring there. And the rat is quite an important symbol in this poem, okay, and it symbolises almost the injustice of untimely death and the fact that although death may be inevitable, the speaker argues that even the lowliest creatures, such as rats, don't deserve to die so cruelly, okay, in a cruel way. So where she talks about how it just lays in the mud of the drive, that is the argument that essentially this particular candidate could have gone on, okay. The idea of, you know, but she recounts a years old memory of coming upon a large dead rat, which is sort of just lying there in a muddy road on a spring evening, okay. And the speaker remembers thinking that although rats are, you know, quite vile sort of creatures, like any creature, it should be alive during the spring month. So the focus on any, like as in during springtime, that a rat should be alive, any creature should be alive, okay? She describes it, and the candidate doesn't touch upon that, but she describes it as a God-forsaken thing, suggesting that even most dreadful and seemingly insignificant creatures should be allowed to live in the spring. So the focus on spring there is that, you know, spring is the time of birth, a time of life, and it's in this particular response here, when we're looking at the band 3 overview, we're not really getting that coming through, okay. There is just a quick kind of link then to Millay, who says, on the other hand, she thinks death is actually a part of spring. So not really capitalising on the idea that Mew believes that spring is this time of birth, this time of growth, quite possibly, and that during this time, in particular, May, as she comments in her poem, that everything, all creatures, despite being seemingly insignificant, deserve to be alive, okay? So that's something that maybe this candidate could have done here, okay, when it comes to the connection. So just lacking a little bit of development there, okay. The band 4 one, you can see obviously these ones are a little bit longer. So the longer, the kind of better they get, the longer they get seemingly, okay, but that isn't always the case, okay. So The Boundful Response, when it comes to death in relation to spring, their views contrast, okay? So making that real connection, okay? Saying that they've both got contrasting views here, okay? And this is the sort of terminology you want to be using, okay? So the idea of contrasting. So Malay believes spring is dishonest, tries to hide death by flowers, so using then the imagery, okay? And that's something they could maybe add here. They could look at the use of imagery, okay? Of the crocus and good smells. She accuses spring in a flat, direct statement of a line. It is apparent that there is no death. While Mew, who has identified with the spring life of the trees, sees death as having no part to play in spring. Her description of a dead rat makes it seem out of place in spring, and chooses a series of verbs to make us experience that out of place death, turning in at a gate, getting out of a cart, and finding a large dead rat in the mud of the drive. So it opens in a really sort of promising and positive way where you've got that clear contrast, okay? And it looks at, while Mew, okay, so looking at the opposing here as well, who's identified spring life of trees, sees death as having no part to play in spring, okay? So you've got the two contrasting views, okay, where one perceives spring, as it states here, as being dishonest, okay, who is almost concealing death, okay, whereas the other believes that death has no place in spring at all. And then we've got the Band 5 response here, where it states that both poets use death to emphasise their experience of spring. While mourning the death of the trees, Mew remembers the death of a rat she once saw in springtime. So notice how they're all picking up on this rat imagery, okay? So clearly a really important focal point, okay? So again, looking at the idea that similarly to the trees, that all creatures are deserved of a kind of a lively spring and should be mourned, and that the rat then stands kind of is representative for all living things who are possibly taken for granted and maybe whose death is disregarded, quite possibly, is what the poet wanted us to possibly consider and to think about, okay? So both poets use death to emphasise their experience of spring, okay? So again, you've got the use of the both, okay? Clear focus. While mourning the death of the trees, Mew remembers the death of a rat she once saw in springtime. For her, okay, so clearly for her, so she's obviously different to the other poet, spring should be so full of life that even a rat should be alive. She uses short rhyming lines to link the rat and the trees to emphasise her feelings, though even a dead rat seems out of place in spring. Just one bough, green and high, and lonely against the sky, and but for that, if an old dead rat did once for a moment and make the spring. So here the candidate uses, some detailed textual selection there, okay, but then goes on to develop that. So here the echoing rhymes, that rat, link the last of the boughs to the poor rat, so that we hear once again in the poem the destruction of spring. So that's a really clever image, okay, so almost as though there's a sense of destruction linked to spring. If for Mew, spring and death are opposed, Malay sees no difference between them, okay? So again, look at the use of the connections that are being made here. Malay, differently to Mew, sees no difference between spring and death, okay? For Mew, spring and death should not be associated. They should be two very separate things, whereas Malay feels that they should be combined. They should be viewed as one. Her grotesque image of the brains of men eaten by maggots is part of spring, whereas for Mew, spring is positive and seems to be life itself. Malay says life itself is nothing. And whereas, okay, and again, use of the connectives here, okay, and the comparisons, whereas Mew equates spring with May, trees and birds, the much more cynical Malay sees spring as an April Fool, and a poem ends with a shockingly disrespectful, noisy simile. April comes like an idiot, babbling and strewing flowers. Mew sees spring as a part of a meaningful, created world and ends with an angel crying. Malay, who sees nothing meaningful in spring, ends with an idiot babbling. So a really purposeful connection where this particular candidate looks at the ending of both, okay? how one ends in a, with this very important image of the angel, and the other looks at the idiot babbling. Okay, so most definitely when we're looking at the number of connections that we've got coming through here, so even if we look at the use of the comparison connectives, so you've got both here, you've got for her, which shows that it's a little bit different. Malay sees no difference, whereas, okay, and there is this sense that throughout this overview, there's a consideration of both viewpoints. Okay. Here then, what we've got is a snippet from the mark scheme. Okay, where we're focusing on the AO1. So again, reminding you of the question. So compare the presentation of Spring in poem A, The Trees Are Down by Charlotte Mew, and in one other poem. Okay. So the mark scheme tells us that informed responses will demonstrate clear understanding of the chosen poems, that they intend to reward creatively engaged responses for thoughtful and personal rather than mechanical and literal approaches, that they understand and can apply concepts when it comes to the principles and conventions of poetry. The accuracy and coherence will be seen in the way knowledge is used, to ensure that you write in an academic and appropriate academic style, appropriate use of terminology. Okay. And then it tells us a kind of where you'd be with your bands. So if we look from band 3 above, band 3 responses will show more consistently relevant focus, with some clear explanation of the relationships between the speakers and the experience of the spring in the poems. 4 and 5 will show evidence of secure understanding of relevant concepts, combined with a perceptive and fluent discussion. Okay, and it's that perception, that fluency in the discussion and in the connection that's important. So we're going to have a look at the poems, the 2 poems now. So we're going to look at The Trees Are Down, and we're also going to look at Edna St Vincent Millay's as well. Okay, so we'll start off looking at Charlotte Mew's The Trees Are Down. Okay, so Charlotte Mew wrote The Trees Are Down in the 1920s after watching workers saw down trees in London's Euston Square Gardens. Okay, so the speaker quite poignantly narrates. Okay, and the poignancy is really important because it's the tone in which she says it. There's this real sense of regret and remorse at what's happened to these trees. Okay, she narrates about the trees and how they have this slow death, by positioning them within a wider network of kind of like living things, and the environmental concerns that like we noticed in the Examiner commentary are a common thread throughout the body of her poetic work, which often examines the complexity really of the nature of the human's relationship with nature itself. Okay, so we'll have a look at the poem. So they are cutting down the great plane trees at the end of the gardens. For days there has been the grate of the saw, the swish of the branches as they fall, the crash of the trunks, the rustle of trodden leaves, with the whoops and the woes, the loud common talk, the loud common laughs of the men above it all. I remember one evening of a long past spring, turning in at a gate, getting out of a cart and finding a large dead rat in the mud of the drive. I remember thinking, alive or dead, a rat was a God-forsaken thing. But at least, in May, that even a rat should be alive. The week's work here is as good as done. There is just one bough on the roped bowl, in the fine grey rain, green and high, and lonely against the sky. Down now, and but for that, if an old dead rat did once, for a moment, and make the spring, I might never have thought of him again. It is not for a moment the spring is unmade today. These were great trees. It was in them from root to stem, when the men with the whoops and the woes have carted the whole of the whispering loveliness away. Half the spring will have gone with them, for me will have gone with them. It is going now, and my heart has been struck with the hearts of the plains. Half my life it has beat with these, in the sun, in the rains, in the March wind, the May breeze, and the great gales that came over to them across the roofs from the great seas. There was only a quiet rain when they were dying. They must have heard the sparrows flying, and the small creeping creatures in the earth where they were lying. But all day, I heard an angel crying, hurt not the trees. Okay, so if we have a look at this poem, what we've got here is an unspecified group of people who are cutting down these really grand trees at the sort of furthest part of a group of gardens, okay? We get a sense that they've been doing it for days, causing a real ruckus that includes saws and noise, okay? And we get a sense that the leaves that kind of they rustle as they're trampled over, and there's a sense that like the people working there, the men that she describes, there's no care or compassion being given towards the natural world. The sounds of like the rustling of the leaves as they're being trampled over. You can see here the crash of the trunks, the rustle of the trodden leaves. Let me just get the colour. The rustle of the trodden leaves here, okay? So if we look at that particular aspect, okay, and you get the use of the sort of sound that's being used here, okay, and it's quite sensory, it's quite heightened, and that's just accompanied with the onomatopoeic whoops and the woes and the loud common talk, and it's accompanied with like the voices and the loud voices of the male workers who we assume are kind of talking, laughing quite crudely as they cut down the trees, and it's as though their voices are dominating, and their voices are kind of cutting across nature and interrupting nature. She calls it the loud common talk, and it's the common that kind of suggests to us, like here, the idea that it's quite crude, the way in which they're speaking, okay? The loud common talks and the loud common laughs of the men. And the fact that the common and the loud is repeated here, we get a sense that it's clearly an issue, and she feels that this is what's dominating at this point, okay? The speaker is reminded of a spring some kind of years ago as she enters the gate, okay? But what's quite sort of quite prominent here is this use of the biblical allusion, okay? So you've got the link here to the book of Revelation, and he cried with a loud voice, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees. So that biblical allusion, or that biblical reference at the start, is perhaps a reference to the fact that trees are sort of significant in many of the world's regions, and possibly been given quite deep and quite sacred meanings throughout the ages as well. And then we've got at the end this angel crying, okay? If you look at that section, okay, the angel crying. And it shows sort of almost like the depth of feelings here and the magnitude of emotions that Mew feels towards, or the distress that she feels towards the cutting down and the destruction that is prominent, okay? We've got the use of the imagery of kind of unmake the spring as well, okay? Did once for a moment unmake the spring. So imagery here, it shows kind of like de-creation, kind of going against God's natural order and the natural world that has been created. So again, you've got that, you know, almost a semantic field of religious imagery that's being sort of presented then throughout, okay? The first line of the poem opens with, they are cutting down, and we're kind of pushed in right in the middle of the action, okay? It dives directly into the poem, and it leaves the reader kind of almost wondering who the they are, okay? It opens with this phrase, they are cutting down the great plane trees at the end of the gardens. So it makes us wonder who the they are. Then, like I said, we've touched on the onomatopoeia. You've got the onomatopoeia of the men and the tools cutting the trees. She talks about them here as quite brash, and we get a sense that they are quite rough, and it's definitely kind of in contrast to the natural sounds of the trees themselves. we get a sense that, you know, with the whoops and the woes, okay, that the men are making these quite kind of like deep guttural sounds, while the kind of the trees and the natural world, kind of the calm of the swish of the branches, okay, most definitely give you a very kind of conflicting and contrasting image of two different aspects, okay. So the swish of the branches most definitely contrast with here, so the swish of the branches, okay, contrast with the kind of the crashing of the trunks and the common laughs and the whooping and the wooing, okay. She also uses the alliterative juxtaposition with the repeated whoops and woes later on, and you've got that with the in line with the whispering wind that she uses a little bit later on, okay. Where here, okay, so here you've got the use of the whispering, okay, and what that sort of suggests to us is it emphasizes the difference and kind of like the degree of contrast between kind of Moo's emotion and the feelings that she has for these trees, okay. And like I said, the loud and the common is repeated to emphasize the idea of the kind of maybe lack of intelligence of the men, quite possibly, questioning the right that maybe they have to destroy nature that's developed over a course of centuries. And we do get a sense of kind of desolation and loss presented as if the trees were kind of, you know, what was directing her and keeping her on a certain path in life, and they've been with her through the variations of nature. So she talks about the sun, and she talks about the rain and the wind, okay, so you're looking at very kind of natural qualities as well. The poem portrays not only the trees being chopped down, but also the poet herself, and how she maybe was cut down, emotionally destroyed by something in her life, okay. We get a sense that there may be some sort of contextual biographical context linked to that as well, okay. If we look at as well the phrase "my heart," let me just find it here. So my heart has been struck with the hearts of the plains, okay. And it kind of gives credibility to the thought that these trees may have been, you know, possibly similar trees to what she had in her own garden, quite possibly. And the repetition of the heart shows kind of like the metaphorical kind of pain, and how she believes that the trees themselves have hearts, and they're like people to her, okay. Obviously we've got the use with the quiet rain here, the use of pathetic fallacy, okay, so using that to kind of really create a really quite intense mood and atmosphere, linking to the death and linking to something that is almost inevitable now. You could even comment here, if you were looking at this, look at the use of her first person sort of narrative. It suggests that she has a real kind of connection with the trees in relation to her own life. The trees could possibly be an extended metaphor, you could argue, for her life, and how maybe death has affected her, and it allows us maybe using that extended metaphor to have access to kind of her deepest emotions, okay. So what we've got here, these workers, their task for the week is kind of drawing to a close, you know, just about essentially done, and there's one single limb remaining on the last tree trunk, okay, and it's marked with rope, and the tall green branches sort of quite lonely in the grey sky from which kind of delicate raindrops fall. And then you've got the use of the speech, so down now in the middle here, okay, where what you've got is the worker sort of crying out and indicating that the men are cutting down the final tree. And again, that's quite a poignant, hard-hitting sort of message that's being expressed, okay? The tree's remains are sort of carted off, and that really hurts the speaker, okay? That's where that heart bit sort of comes in, okay? She feels that, you know, her heart has beat along with those trees for half of her life across numerous seasons, kind of weathering, like she says, the March winds, the May breezes, and the kind of powerful gusts that travelled the trees from the seas across the rooftops. And she says there's only the quiet sound of rain as the trees were dying, and saying things like the trees here, towards the end, the trees must have heard sparrows kind of flitting about and little creatures creeping through the earth where they lay. And the speaker believes that all day she's heard the cries of an angel calling out not to hurt the trees, okay? So you've got some, you know, quite key themes that are shown throughout this poem. So you're looking at maybe sort of the relationship between nature and humankind, you know, where she looks at kind of the cruelty of the men and the violent destruction as she views it, okay? You've got obviously the use of kind of death and death imagery, okay? So the trees dying, you've got the death of the rat as well, okay? And we get a sense that the speaker's own experience of death is something as well. Obviously, the most prominent theme to discuss here is that of spring, okay, because that is what the question focus is, isn't it? Okay, looking at spring, okay. So types of things you could look at is, you know, the fact that spring is a traditional symbol for life and rebirth, and most definitely the poem employs that symbolism while kind of adding to its own sense of the cruelty of death associated with it, okay. You could look with this is that how spring marks a shift from kind of being quite dormant to growth and liveliness in the natural world. Obviously, springtime, thinking in a Christian way, especially with the biblical references that she uses, looking at kind of Jesus rising kind of from the dead in spring, furthering its associations with this idea of rebirth and renewal. And the speaker sets the poem in almost like a present day spring and a past spring, where she references its months, the weather patterns, the abilities that spring shows as well, okay? And also, though, presents a kind of a juxtaposed kind of contrast between, you know, the loss of life that the speaker witnesses, like of the rat and then the trees, and this kind of vivaciousness and liveliness that we associate with spring. According to the speaker, we get a sense that such deaths or such tragedy and make spring, and kind of it's almost though it's like impacting nature and throwing nature off its normal course almost, okay? And it really shows this idea that symbol for life and renewal to stress the cruelty of the tree's death, okay? So it goes against the norm and what should be happening, okay? We'll have a brief look now at the other poem, okay? So we'll have a look at poem D, Spring, by Edna St Vincent Millay. So a much briefer poem in comparison. Possibly one of the reasons why it was one of the most popular choices that were by candidates. So we'll have a read through this initially. To what purpose, April, do you return again? Beauty is not enough. You can no longer quiet me with the redness of little leaves opening stickily. I know what I know. The sun is hot on my neck as I observe the spikes of the crocus. The smell of the earth is good. It is apparent that there is no death. But what does that signify? Not only underground are the brains of men eaten by maggots. Life in itself is nothing, an empty cup, a flight of uncarpeted stairs. It is not enough that yearly down this hill April comes like an idiot babbling and strewing flowers. So spring, like we've discussed, okay, if we're looking at the question focus, typically seen as a time where the world is meant to come back to life, okay, where we have bare branches filling out with kind of lush green leaves, and this variety of animals can be seen going about their tasks. But the poet here goes against this perception in her poem Spring, and she tells us in quite angry and quite blunt language that the beauty of nature can't compensate for the existence of death, okay? The poem kind of refuses to participate in what she views as a lie, and instead depicts death with the kind of this kind of graphic and repulsive image, okay? So we get a sense her poem goes further by depicting the good qualities of nature we see in the spring as, like I said, a lie that can give us a false sense that death doesn't exist. So she wants to look at the idea of realism associated with spring, okay? Because what we've got is this symbol or this representation of spring is what she's arguing, similar to how Moo presented it, and that death should not occur during this. This is the time for renewal, rebirth. This is a time of growth. And she's almost saying that, like, you know, April or springtime, it doesn't, you know, the idea of it takes no prisoners, as in it doesn't matter what time of year it is, okay, death still occurs, okay? The poem sort of starts off by addressing nature and asking a rhetorical question with, to what purpose, April, do you return again? And that line itself, okay, to what purpose, April, do you return again, with that use of the rhetorical question, is really harsh and really blunt in its tone. So already we get a sense of like the aggressive tone that the poet has, and the kind of negative, pessimistic attitude that she has towards the lies that she believes people are fed about spring, okay? Notice here how she refers to spring as April, okay? And that's repeated a little bit later on as well, okay? The idea of April. And we get a sense that, you know, she doesn't believe, okay? It's almost as though she's personifying the poem and naming the season rather than spring, naming it as April, okay? We get a sense that she's really unsatisfied, okay? But interestingly, by naming the poem or naming spring as April, she's actually giving an inanimate thing, spring, a woman's name. So almost bring in this sense of like a connection through that sort of almost personifying spring as a person here, okay? And then you've got that kind of harsh statement of beauty is not enough, okay? As in beauty isn't enough for the, like, of a reason here for the seasons to return, okay? The use of the not enough is really quite important, and it's repeated later on as well, if you look here towards the end, okay? So it is not enough. So it is not enough, and the repetition of that phrase strengthens her overall portrayal of spring as something quite negative. And in both instances, using that phrase, the author sort of denounces the significance of the season's return, causing the reader to view spring in a really negative light. Towards the end, if we keep going through, so you can no longer quiet me with the redness of little leaves opening stickily, okay? And even just the tone of the little leaves is so like it lacks importance. So if we're looking at the way in which they're being presented, that shows some real significance as well. And this sense of like the author, the poet, having more knowledge than April, than spring, saying, I know what I know, okay? And this, you know, we get a sense that here Millay is really trying to, you know, provoke when it comes to her challenges towards spring here, okay? And that is further shown towards the end, where in a state of sort of despair, she, the speaker of the poem, depicts life as absurd. She says, life in itself is nothing, an empty cup. a flight of uncarpeted stairs. And she's almost saying that things like spring, it signifies nothing, okay? And she similarly tells us that it isn't enough that yearly down this hill April comes like an idiot, babbling and strewing flowers. Almost the sense that it's doomed is the feeling that we've got, okay? And there is this sense of kind of horror being shown in the descriptions of new life, of spring, in the way that she calls it kind of like, she looks at the idea of little leaves opening stickily, and the redness. So you can look at the even imagery of the redness and the sense of maybe the blood wounds quite possibly linked to that, okay? And it's almost as though what the poet is trying to do is kind of bury images of death in its description of new life in nature, and sort of trying to show that that's almost what she views as this terrible truth about mortality, and how it's poorly hidden in the appearance of rebirth in the spring, okay? We get a sense that this poem definitely stands in contrast to the other poem that we were looking at, okay? So looking at poem A, and then obviously here with poem D. If we have a quick look at the overview, okay, here, we get a real sense of, you know, the importance of the connections and the comparisons. And here what you've got is just an outline from the WJC mark scheme, looking at the types of connections that could have been made, okay? So in relation to the two poems that we've looked at, so the types of connections we could make is the fact that spring is seen as positive in Mew, but negative or very little importance or significant in Malays. We've got really quite rich sensuous language in Mew's, kind of the sensory images, so, but then mostly bleak and even quite abstract language that Malay uses. The fact that Mew uses quite poetic rhyming stanzas, but Malay almost kind of argues her way through her poem. There's a real appreciation of beauty of nature in Mew's, and then obviously nature is viewed as quite ugly, where she uses, say for example, the maggot imagery that's used, okay? Both use quite short lines, okay, for striking effect. We both get the sense that humans in the view of Mew are kind of letting nature down, and then similarly we get a sense that humans are being disappointed by nature, okay? So they're the types of connections that you could potentially make, all right? And I have included on the next couple of slides the connections that you could have made if you chose to look at the other poems. So if you want to go and give those poems a try yourselves, then that obviously would be quite